Darkcast Network. Welcome to the dark side of podcasts.
A single photo exists of three men. They are clearly men of the mountain. Ropes and poles expertly placed around them. Their orange jackets are vibrant against the snow standing as a backdrop behind them. Their black pants look warm, and all three have huge grins on their faces. Despite them wearing goggles, you can tell the smiles reach their eyes. They are happy and excited to be there, for they are on Denali, the tallest mountain in North America, the tallest climb from base to summit, and one of the hardest mountains to climb in the world. Due to its location, Denali has worse weather than Everest. It is colder, the air is thinner. Denali is one of the most brutal mountains that climbers can face. It is isolated, with less predictable weather that often lasts for long periods of time, making the summit one of the most rewarding experiences for those who are brave enough to face down the elements. In 1999, 43% of climbers who stepped foot on Denali intending to reach its peak did so. And as luck would have it, the mountain claimed 0 lives that year. Welcome back to Tragedy with a View. Hello, welcome back. I am your host, Kayla. I do not have any sort of housekeeping to go with today's episode, so we're just going to dive right into it. Actually, I do have one thing. I've been talking about Fat Bear Week a lot lately. I'm going to tell you exactly how this is going to go because I decided to take a vacation that ended up needing to be almost completely replanned, and buying a house and doing a full week's worth of episodes all at the same time, and things just kind of got crazy. Fat Bear Week ended up not being the week that I thought it was going to be because it's mostly run in October. This time it's being in September, so I have 2 episodes that are coming out next week. The week after that is going to be a subscriber-only episode, and then the following week I'm going to release the other 2 Fat Bear Week stories. Things got a little bit messy. As I mentioned in one of the earlier episodes, it ended up being so much more work than I had anticipated to kind of get everything coordinated and to prepare these episodes. And so it is the first and only Fat Bear Week that's turning into 2 weeks worth of episodes spread over 3 weeks. You get the point. They'll be out. They'll be available to you. There are not going to be any subscriber-only episodes out of the Fat Bear episodes, so you can listen to them at your will. So getting right into this week's episode. At 29 years old, Nigel Vardy was the youngest member of the 3-person team who had their eyes set on the summit of Denali. Normally surrounded by clouds, their hopes had been that they would be able to get there on a day with a clear view, but Nigel would be happy to make it to the peak and back in one piece. He had no idea how hard he was going to have to fight for that. Growing up in Derbyshire, which is located right around the center of England, Denali was a far trip from home for him. While he has climbing experience, Denali was his first big expedition that he would be participating in. Also from England was Anthony Hollinshead, who went by Ant. At 33 years old, he had grown up in Shropshire, and Ant was full of life. He was energetic. He had this energy about him that was just contagious, and he was also a foodie, which I love. He was known to take freeze-dried meals and doctor them up into something mouth-watering for his mountaineering companions. Companions like fellow climber Steve Ball. Steve and Ant were best friends. They had been climbing for years, and Steve had grown up also in England and was 42 years old, nearly a full decade older than Ant. Steve had been climbing for nearly 2 decades, and he also loved it. He was drawn to the mountains, and he had a great sense of humor that helped ease the hard parts during the climbs. Denali had been on Steve's radar for some time now. He just hadn't found the right people to do it with. Being a serious climber, he took who his partners were seriously. As the saying goes, you don't rise to the occasion, rather you sink to your level of training. It is inevitable that mountaineers will experience hardship on the mountains. Things are going to go wrong, and you have to know and trust those you are climbing with. So when Ant, Steve, and Nigel decided to climb Denali together, the planning began, and all of them were extremely excited. They took 6 months to plan their trip, their routes, the timing, all the gear they would need, and to learn more about each other as people. Nigel and Ant were both just fun guys to be around, and Steve was setting his sights on a dream climb. What could go wrong? Well, as it turns out, quite a bit. As we have already stated, Denali is the tallest mountain in North America, standing at 20,310 feet or 6,190 meters in elevation. For clarification, also, Mount Denali and Mount McKinley are the same mountain. There is quite a naming scandal as of late, and the short version of its history is that the peak was called some version of Denali until 1917, when it was renamed Mount McKinley. In 2015, Obama reverted the name back to Denali, and this year, in 2025, the Trump administration brought the federal name back to Mount McKinley, but Denali is the recognized name for the peak. Denali means the Great One in Athabascan, which is just a great way to continue to honor the history and the traditions of the people who have called this land home far before the mountains were ever climbed. Denali stands at nearly the center of the 600-mile-long Alaskan mountain range, and it is part of the Seven Peaks, which is this challenge where mountaineers will climb the tallest peaks on each continent. The Seven Peaks include Everest in Asia, Aconcagua in South America, Denali in North America, Kilimanjaro in Africa, Mount Elbrus in Europe, Vinson Massif in Antarctica, and Carstenson's Pyramid for Australia, or technically it is in the Australasia area. No matter what route you decide to go on, climbing Denali is a massive undertaking, with many requiring weeks to be able to acclimate to the elevation, the thinner air, and to move their gear from camp to camp as they go. Many expeditions have to carry all of their gear for the 2 to 4 weeks with them, dodging poor weather as they go. They accomplish this by carrying their gear higher up on the mountain, stashing it either in the snow or at the next camp, and then returning to the lower elevation. This also allows them to acclimatize to the lower amounts of oxygen at the same time. The most popular route by far is the West Buttress route, which takes most climbers between 2 and 4 weeks to complete. But Nigel, Steve, and Ant decided they would be taking on the much less popular West Rib route. In 2024, 974 people stepped onto Denali's slopes, and while the park does not typically release information about what routes these people take, it is noted that 90% of people each year take the West Buttress route. This is because West Rib is much more technical due to the amount of snow and ice that stays on this part of the mountain. There are also very steep ledges, narrow ridges, and a gully that requires several thousand feet of ice climbing. As with anywhere on the mountain, the weather plays a significant role in the climbability. But the West Rib route is known for its dramatic landscapes, giving those who climb it a feeling of climbing the mountain in a more pure way, which maybe isn't the best option for Nigel, who is making his first big climb ever. But that is not for me to decide what others can handle. It is Sunday, May 16th, 1999, when the three fly to base camp at 7,000 feet in elevation. They meet with Annie, who is the park employee stationed at base camp, And while this is called base camp, it is not truly at the base of the mountain. They still have to travel several miles to begin their climb. They figure out their radios and make sure that they can make contact with Annie, who will be giving them weather updates as they climb. The three settle in for the night at base camp, knowing that they have 21 days of hard work ahead of them. But they are elated to hear that for the foreseeable future, they have great weather ahead of them. But as with all things, that can change quickly on Denali. The following day, they trek the 7 miles to the base of Denali, where the true work begins. As others are splitting off for the West Buttress route, Steve, Ant, and Nigel force their way through the untouched path towards West Rib. That day, they only make it 3 miles. When it is time for them to camp, they have to build a wall of snow and ice around their tent to protect them from the ferocious winds that roar across the mountain. This would be something that they do every time they set up camp. And again, they are traveling back and forth on these same paths multiple times to move all of their gear from one location to the next. It is not as simple as just being able to carry all of their items with them. On the 4th day, Nigel falls into a crevasse. This is the first time that he has ever fallen inside one. As is customary in mountaineering, Steve, Nigel, and Ant had been roped together with about 30 feet of rope between them. They walked with the rope pretty taut so that in the event that someone, like Nigel, falls into a crevasse, it stops their plunge to their death. And the slack also doesn't rip someone off their feet and drag them down as well. Nigel is able to climb out, but then during the remainder of the day, he would fall into 2 more crevasses. By the 3rd time, when Nigel feels the ground give way beneath him, he chuckles to himself, wondering, what else am I supposed to do? Though I have a feeling Steve has some different thoughts going through his head. On day 5, the 3 make it to 11,000 feet in elevation. They're over halfway to the peak at this point, and they're just trucking along. Behind them, they see another team making their way up the mountain. This is the American team, and when Nigel, Steve, and Ant realize this, there's a little bit of a competitive ego in the air, kind of with it being like Brits versus the Americans. And by this point, their exertion level is so high that they're rapidly losing weight. This is a normal part of mountaineering and the mountaineering experience. Between the body trying to stay warm, laying the lines, carrying the gear, setting up camp, breaking down camp, and the added stress on the body of less oxygen, it's just impossible to be able to carry, let alone consume, the amount of calories a fully grown man needs in order to maintain weight while summiting a mountain. And while they had been moving pretty decently up until this point, it wouldn't be until the following day, day 6, that the 3 would enter into the real technical part of the climb. The climb begins to steepen, and as they go, they have to figure out their way through deep snow and thick ice. This day was so much harder than they anticipated, and they ended up getting back to their camp way later than expected, and decided to use the following day as a rest day. During this, the American team overtakes them, and at that point, they're just kind of like, let them. But when this happens, Nigel begins to question if he was the right person to fill out this team. This is his first experience climbing a huge mountain. In the distance, as they climb, they can hear avalanches crack and then rumble down the mountain. It's a daunting feeling knowing that you are in a place that can so easily become a death trap. Yet, they push on. The following day, though, they step it into gear and they make it to 13,000 feet, the same stopping point that the Americans chose.
Sometimes it's not the loudest stories that keep us up at night. It's the quiet ones. The ones that never quite made the headlines. The ones that left behind more questions than answers. The Final Trace is a true crime podcast about the strange, the unresolved, and the stories that slip through the cracks. From disappearances to mysterious deaths. to cases that were technically solved, but still don't sit right. We dig into the overlooked, the eerie, and the human side of every story. Because even when a case goes cold, there's always something left behind. A clue, a feeling, a final trace. Follow The Final Trace wherever you listen to podcasts, and come find what still lingers in the silence. I'm your host, Hopper Daly, and this is The Final Trace.
By day 10, they make it to almost 14,000 feet. It is on day 11 that something starts to break down. Steve and Nigel head off to break the ground for their next relay of gear up the mountain, and when they return, Ant mentions to them that he doesn't like how he's being treated. Up until now, Ant was the one who has been staying in his own one-man tent. He was regularly being left to cook and clean up their camp and break things down and get ready to move, while Steve and Nigel were heading up the slope. Ant wasn't thrilled about this, and so when he brings it up, that they will start taking more turns with who is doing what. And so just to clarify a couple of things, one, I think this is incredible communication and being able to and proof of being able to trust the team that you are with to hear you and to address issues appropriately. And the other thing is that Nigel and Steve were staying together in a two-person tent, and Ant was staying in a one-person tent. And they're doing this because if you get larger tents that fit more people, they also tend to be a little bit taller, which then starts allowing for more space where cold air can get in, and it's just not as well insulated for these high altitude mountain climbing in frozen weather that Denali has. And so having these two smaller tents was ideal for this team. On day 12, their goal is to make it to 16,000 feet. To get there, there's a lot more intense climbing where they have to Jumar up a rope. A Jumar is a device that you would attach to a rope that has one attached to a harness and the other is attached to a rope that holds your feet. This is essentially the same as a Prusik knot, but instead of friction knots holding your weight, it is the device. To ascend the rope, you would stand up in the footholds, releasing the weight on the harness, move the harness Jumar up as high as you can, and then when you sit back down in the harness, this allows you to tuck your feet up and move the foot Jumar up to meet the harness Jumar, and then just rinse and repeat. This, again, takes them longer than expected, and they don't make it to camp until 3:30 in the morning, deciding to take a second rest day for day 13. On day 14, they establish camp at 6,300 feet, and it is in this process that Steve loses a glove. Gloves and cold weather gear are critical on Denali, and Steve is in luck as Nigel had an extra pair. But the reality of the situation begins to set in. They cannot lose their gear here. On day 15, Ant's tent is nearly destroyed by a rock that punctures a hole in the side and broke a support pole. They do their best to fix it, but with the knowledge that they're now losing gear, they only have 8 days until their departing flights. They are only at 16,300 feet. They know they have to make some moves if they are going to accomplish their goals. And so with that, they decide to attempt to summit the following day, returning back to 16,300 feet after summiting. To be clear, that's just under 4,000 feet of climbing up and then turning around and climbing down that same distance in one day. They would pack only what was absolutely necessary so that way they could be lighter and therefore faster. And as we know from previous stories, this isn't always the best idea. It is early on day 16 when they wake and set out for their summit bid. As they climb, they take turns who is in the lead. The lead person is breaking the ground, so as they tire, they switch around the group so that way someone with more energy can take over. They are less than a mile from the summit when they reach a section of the climb called the plateau. As the name indicates, this is an area known for being flat, which means that the wind here is atrocious. There is nothing to stop it, nothing to slow it down. On Denali, there aren't even other mountains in the area to act as a buffer because Denali rises so much farther above the others. The wind is relentless and strong and seems to only suck the oxygen out of the air as they are trying to breathe. The men wore goggles and balaclavas to protect their faces from the elements, but Nigel's was just not staying put. His cheeks had a thin layer of ice that developed on them where his balaclava was exposing skin. Finally, though, they made it to the peak, only to realize that they didn't actually summit at all. They were on the north summit, a false summit, and 1,500 feet below where they intended to be. To make matters worse, Steve is clearly suffering from hypothermia. His speech is slurred, he isn't making a lot of sense, and he continues to complain about the cold. They need to find shelter fast to warm Steve up and save him. The only way to cure hypothermia is to warm the body, so that is what Nigel and Ant set out to do. But they have not only been fighting their way through 70-mile-per-hour winds to reach the summit, but these same winds have been slicing through their jackets and pants, slowly lowering their body temperatures. Nigel and Ant are both aware that if Steve got hypothermia, they probably aren't too far behind him. They find a crevasse-like cave at the base of the false summit that they feel is safe enough to crawl inside. They use their ice axes to widen the opening and pull rocks out so that way they can all fit inside. And then inside they crawl. They use their packs to block the opening and then huddle together, hugging to stay warm. Steve is just ranting about nothing. He was delirious. Nigel is drifting in and out of consciousness, and at some point he realizes that they have a radio. They can call for help. After much discussion between Nigel and Ant, Nigel crawls out of the cave so that the radio will work, and he tries to connect to base camp and finds that he can't get through. The distance between where they're at on the mountain and the base camp doesn't offer consistent connections, and while he could hear them, they could not hear him. All that was on the receiving end of the call was static. Finally, they decided to use a Morse code form of communicating. Base camp tells Nigel to click once for no and twice for yes. To figure out who they are talking to, base camp starts to ask Nigel if he is part of this expedition or that expedition, and once they finally figure out who he is with, they can pull the permit and find the route that they were going to go on and see who all was in this party. The next question is, do you need a rescue? And Nigel is desperate at this point and clicks 2 times for yes, and then twice again as if to reiterate that yes, we do need a rescue. And that is when he gets the news that it is too dangerous to send a rescue up with a storm and the night approaching. They will have to wait until morning when a plane is able to fly up there to locate them and begin the rescue. And as a side note, I have no idea what happened to the American team at this point. I'm guessing that they either are on the quote-unquote correct path to the actual summit, or maybe they were fast enough that they were able to get up and then they're already heading back down and just didn't cross paths with Nigel or Steve or Ant. But there's not a lot of mention of them after they overtook the team we're talking about here. No matter, inside their small cave, the weather base camp had warned them about moves in. The wind is disastrously strong, creating whistles and roars that would trick even the sanest of people into thinking they hear someone just outside calling for help. The 3 have to scream to each other to be able to be heard through the night, and they do their best to keep the mood light by telling awful jokes and huddling together. By the next morning, Steve seemed to pull out of his hypothermic daze, but Nigel's feet feel like blocks of ice. When Nigel crawls out of the cave again at 8 a.m., he pulls the radio out of his jacket and fumbles. He loses his grip on the radio and it tumbles down the side of Denali, a clear sign that his hands are not faring much better than his feet. At this point, the three realize that they are going to need to self-rescue. No one is going to be able to help them where they are at. So the three emerge from their shelter. Nigel begins to wonder if he can maybe down climb to get the radio. He can see it, and as he's leaning over the slope, he falls. Nigel slides down the slope completely out of control. He doesn't have an ice axe or anything with him to slow his descent when all of a sudden he thuds to a stop, right next to the radio. While it is in one piece, the radio does not seem to be working any longer. And so, Nigel climbs back up the slope to rejoin Steve and Ant. As they start their way down, they hear a plane, but due to the thick cloud cover, they never see it and it never sees them. But things are about to get worse. Nigel's feet are hurting badly, and he can't see out of his left eye at all. His sight is so bad that Ant is holding his arm and leading the way, and when they get to the point where Nigel can no longer move forward on his own, he can't walk, he can't down climb a rope, so Steve and Ant step aside to have their own little powwow, and they decide that Steve is going to keep going to get help and Ant is going to stay with Nigel. This makes the most sense. Steve has the most experience out of the three of them, but Ant and Nigel are still being left on the plateau, the worst place to be on Denali. Steve's plan, though, is that instead of taking the same route that they came up, he is going to go to the west buttress route. Because it is much more frequently climbed, he hopes that he will run into someone who will be able to help them. Ant and Nigel find a rocky shelter to huddle into, which is less of a shelter and more of a wind block. Steve, determined as he is also not in good condition. He just survived hypothermia after climbing Denali for 17 days. He has none of his essential gear, but he is doing the best he can. He's tired and he's struggling, but he knows that if something happens to him, all of them are going to die. Steve comes to a spot where he needs to down climb this slab of ice, and so he uses his ice axe to keep his traction. But he can tell that hypothermia is creeping back in. He is nervous. He tries to shake his head to clear his mind, and then he has no traction at all. He slides down the ice face, 1,100 feet, where he lands and injures his right leg and breaks his left. Meanwhile, a helicopter is sent to check on the trio. Remember, base camp has no idea what is happening on the mountain because their radio is broken. Nigel and Ant can hear the helicopter, but it never goes high enough on the mountain for them to be seen. And Steve, though injured and alone, is not done yet. The ice slab he went down, he realizes that he should not have come down it at all, and so he uses his ice axe and his less injured leg to drag himself back up the slab of ice. But then he falls again. This time, the pain in his left leg is so bad that he needs to take a look to evaluate the damage. And when he pulls the pant leg up, he finds a bone is sticking out of his leg. He does what he can to stop the bleeding, and then he uses an ice axe to create a splint and continues on. He can't walk, he can barely crawl, and so he finds himself dragging himself to find help for his friends. As night is approaching, or at least the soft-lit glow of sunset in Alaska, Nigel and Ant are delirious. Nigel is not thinking at all when he pulls his gloves off to take a look at his hands, and they are white as the snow. He now has frostbite on his face, his feet, and his hands, and then the glorious sound of a helicopter comes again. This time, they are spotted, and with the radio warming up in Nigel's jacket and the helicopter being so close, they can use it to make a connection. The helicopter can only carry one of them at a time, and with Ant being the better of the two, when the litter is dropped down, he helps Nigel into it and then waits for the helicopter to return, which it does, and they successfully retrieve both Ant and Nigel from Denali's upper slopes. Meanwhile, Ant and Nigel don't realize that Steve is not okay. They thought that he was the one who told the helicopter where to go, where they could be found, when in reality, they had been looking for them all day long. And as night truly sets in, Steve finds himself a spot where he can dig into the snow to rest as the temperature plummets to negative 58 degrees Fahrenheit. But he refuses to fall asleep because he knows that if he falls asleep, he's not going to wake up. He uses his injured leg to do this. So every time he gets drowsy and begins to feel himself fall asleep, he hits his leg so that the pain will wake him back up. It was as the morning light was gracing the mountain that Steve was spotted by the helicopter at the base of Denali Gap. There was no way for the helicopter to land, so Ranger Billy Schott was lowered down where he wrapped Steve in a cover, attached him to the rope, and then the helicopter short-hauled them to safety. All three were taken to the hospital to be treated for their injuries, and all three survived. Nigel lost all of his fingers and toes, part of his cheek and nose. Ant miraculously only lost 2 fingers, but Steve got it worst of all. Steve lost all of the fingers on his right hand, and his left hand removed half of his palm as well as all of his fingers. Part of his nose had to be amputated along with his left leg below the knee and part of his right foot. He did, in fact, break his right leg also, but his left leg was broken in 12 places, and there is no doubt in my mind that the break was a part of the reason that he lost so much more of that leg with the loss of blood supply and the cold. It is stories like this that showcase the incredible resilience and determination that life can bring. It is a story that reminds us that even with meticulous planning and a strong team, Mother Nature always has the final say, and they are lucky to be alive. Thank you for listening. We will talk next week. Bye. What is life without close calls with disaster? Thank you for listening. Don't forget to follow the podcast to be the first to hear the now weekly episodes. Join our subscription on Patreon, Apple, or Spotify today and immerse yourself in the haunting beauty of the great outdoors. For around $4 a month, you'll get exclusive access to the first episode of each month and early access to all other episodes, showcasing the morbid and mysterious side of nature. Please reach out with story requests, and if you have your own story, please email tragedywithaview@gmail.com for a chance to have your story featured on a later episode. Again, thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.